Welcome to the Bold seminar. My name is Samantha, and we are here with our opening keynote panel discussing the next decade in international higher education in K through 12. I am joined by a star-studded cast here, and I'm so delighted that you all are here. Martha Johnson, Christine DeLeon, Utia Rishauderi, Eric Glustrom, and Fabiola Rio. Welcome, all of you. We are delighted to have you today. So we're going to get started right off the bat and with the question of what has international or global education looked like in your life and in your work?
I can jump in and say global engagement to me really is at a crossroad right now, or I would rather say has passed the crossroad. It is in an era of change where, like, knowledge, which is now omnipresent if you have access and can Google, um, the true brilliance here is going to shine for folks who are able to innovate with the given knowledge and adapt to these circumstances. It's going to require a deep understanding of the fundamentals of why are we here in international education. And it's going to need a vision to articulate the relevance and a healthy appetite for change.
Wonderful. We're going to explore a lot about innovation and change. Thanks so much, Utio. Christine, why don't you share where you're joining us from and what international and global education has meant to you in your life and in your work?
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. So based here in Denver, like I told Samantha, I feel like the odd person out because I'm more connected to our K-12 education system, but I would say intrigued by what learning looks like on the whole and what role innovation plays in that. And when I think about the role of international and global education, for me personally, I mean, I think those are have been for me some of the most formative experiences, right? Where I'm developing relationships with people, learning new cultures, opening my mind in a way. I think like you form new synapses anytime you go somewhere new. And I think a lot about, I mean, my work is predominantly with leaders who are building new learning environments for students. And I think I think the power of global education is doing that for our kids, right? Having them like actually fostering and cultivating the curiosity that they're born with. And to start that in K-12 before they're even thinking about higher ed, I think opens up a world of possibility, of learning, of understanding. And I think a lot about like, how are we continuing to think about in our work in K-12, bridging that kind of those types of experiences that I think typically often happen in the higher ed space.
That's wonderful. And Christine, I don't know if it'll come up more, but actually Eric and Fabiola also have some K through 12 experience in their past or current. So maybe that'll shine through. And for those of you, go ahead and check out Moonshot Ed Ventures, which is the organization that Christine founded. It is great. And they just reached a $25,000, I think, goal for your fundraiser for your next generation of educators. So congratulations on that. Fabiola, why don't you share with us as well where you're joining and your experience with global education?
Oh, great. Thank you so much. I am now tuning in from New York. Lovely New York, right? Everyone's in love with New York right now. And so for me, global education is one of those things that's been a way of life. I'm a byproduct of global education where both of my parents migrated to the United States for international education purposes, right, to pursue their higher education. So it's kind of been something that's been ingrained in myself, just in my upbringing of having multiple perspectives and being aware that there are cultures and things that are happening outside of where you stand. And it has taught me, number one, how to think more broadly, and also how to understand who I am more as a person, because I get to understand the polity in my own self based on what my parents had experienced and how they managed to secure their positioning in the United States, but also keep a strong foothold to their own cultural backgrounds and heritage of where they're coming from. So
thank you so much joining us from New York, Fabiola. Eric, let's have you go next, and then Martha will wrap up this round with you.
Sure. Thanks, Samantha. It's a pleasure to be here. And I guess just to, from a personal story perspective with international education, my first experience, was actually in high school. And I had the opportunity in high school, actually in Boulder, Colorado, where I grew up for a lot of my life, to design a human rights related trip anywhere in the world and ask Amnesty International to fund it. And so I ended up creating this experience to make a film in a refugee community in Western Uganda, a place called Changwali. And about a month and a half before I was supposed to go, Amnesty rejected me for the scholarship. And they're like, it's too dangerous. You're too young. We can't have our name on this. And, that was a blessing in disguise, because I called up a mentor of mine and asked her what I should do. And she's like, oh, just go anyways. You got this. So then I convinced my parents to then create this independent trip, no longer connected with Amnesty, to spend about a month in this refugee community, from which I was very inspired by a group of young refugees to focus on education, because they told me that the best way that we could help their community and their country was to help them receive an education. And that really changed my perception and understanding of what the purpose of an education should be. It's not just about going to middle school so we can go to high school, and going to high school so we can go to college so we can get a job. It's an investment in the next generation that will pay off for our communities, for our society, and for future generations. And it really changed my understanding of a purpose of education, and inspired the work with Educate in East Africa, and now with Watson Institute. But I just bring it up because that experience was so formative for me personally, and it really was an international education experience, even if it ended up being on my own and independent in the end.
That's great. And for those of you who don't know, the Watson Institute is based here in Boulder, and also now in Guatemala and elsewhere, supported by Lynn University. Basically, a semester, there's one semester model, we might find out more about this later, where scholars from all over the world come to Boulder, Colorado, and work on a social venture that is supported by a mentorship programming and faculty and coursework in innovation, education, and entrepreneurship that Eric and his team have put together. So thank you for that, Eric. Martha.
Thank you. So I'm Martha Johnson, and I'm the Assistant Dean for Learning Abroad at the University of Minnesota. This summer is the 30th anniversary of my study abroad, so you can do the numbers. And since my first job out of college was working for a study abroad program in London, it means that 2021 will be my 30th anniversary working in the field. I always like to point out that the first 4 or 5 jobs I had, which included working on site back in Ireland and then moving to the UK for 4 years and working at a British university, ultimately doing my PhD at a British university, working for a consortium of Australian universities. Frankly, it was 10 years into the work before it really was a profession. And so I've had the really unique perspective of doing this for many years before it was actually a real recognized profession. It was just a series of kind of cool jobs. So for me, one of the most exciting things over that time has been to see, and I suppose be a part of the first generation of actual professionals who've done it for our whole careers. And so that means that we've had a front row seat to both seeing, but actually creating it. And I think that's one of the things I'm excited about when I see all of you, is because the fascinating thing, and we'll be talking more about this, is that it's nowhere near done. And so I think one of the really rare facets of international education is the ability to be involved in something where it ends is not a foregone conclusion, and we actually get to have a role in shaping what that looks like. So that's
well
me.
said. Well said. Let's talk more about that, actually. Changing times. I want to shift and talk about online learning, actually. And obviously, a lot of this is driven by the pandemic, but obviously online education has been among us for a long time. So there's a lot of debate about whether we go back to classes, we don't. Is this for a moment? Are we now finding new ways to educate? Is this forever? I'm curious to hear from you what you think is the future of online learning in your organization, as well as digital global experiences. And this is open to anyone. And feel free, whoever feels most inspired, to hop in.
I'm happy to kick things off. My study abroad office, we run a lot of our own programs. And so this spring, like many other institutions, we moved 109 study abroad courses online in 2 weeks, and everyone successfully completed things. I like to point out that at the University of Minnesota, I had a discussion with the provost in February when we were talking about just Italy. And actually someone in the leadership at my university said, Martha, you do know the truth is that no one really believes that online learning can be rigorous. Now, of course, about 3 weeks later, the entire University of Minnesota moved online. So I like to say that this was not just a shift of paradigms, but it was a collapsing of paradigms. And I think we've embraced that, and it's kind of been exciting. And so, like other organizations, this summer we have our first 70 virtual interns doing placements around the world. We're expanding that in the fall. And I think we're in this moment of, I remember when we first started doing short-term programs and everyone said that will be the death of study abroad. And they were wrong. So I suppose, there's a part of me that always thinks we will only stay viable if we're able to shift and change. And so as we get our brains around this new virtual environment and what it means for the long term, I think it's exciting.
I guess it's safe to say, thanks so much, Martha, that I kind of echo the same sentiment, right? Because at my institution, although study abroad, actual student mobility was something that was suspended for a long time, we did have a lot of faculty champions that were committed to virtual exchanges. And so as you talk about, business as we know it or education as we know it being completely transformed due to a global pandemic, what we found were these faculty were the rock stars on campus, right? Because they already knew how to integrate technology in their teaching practices and in their skills. So it was almost championing multiple things at once. They were championing the fact that online is something that we all should have been doing and should know how to do and be familiar and comfortable with. But then also that focus in that shift of building up global competency on the campus, and sharing was always now at also in the conversation because that's how they were using the online space. And so that has been a positive shift for us as far as it goes. And, in the fall, we're going to, I think, 10% is going to actually be in-person classes where 90% of our courses are going to remain remote or online. So we're excited to be more active in that space and to do more. So it's been positive for us.
I want to put a pin on some of the stuff that Martha and Fabiola are talking about, which is like, it's the need for the people who are doing this work, like beyond online learning, to be flexible, to be resilient, and think like if you were innovative before, you were like better in this context, you will continue to excel in this context because all we know is next week could look different than this week, and a month from now is completely unpredictable as much as we want to predict it. And so I think a lot about like what behaviors, skills, dispositions are we holding? What are we modeling? And what then does that like kind of push out to the people who are around us? We also have thought a lot, and I know this kind of just goes beyond like what's the future of online ed, but like how are people taking care of themselves during this time? Like what, I think in some ways because it's been about like COVID and health, we have also just been like very cognizant of well-being, right? And like where does well-being come into this, including like I'm on Zoom meetings or I'm somewhere on my screen all day long. What do I need for myself to like continue to stay in this? Because now we know we're in it for a while. So we've just been constantly like doing this kind of back and forth of when do I need to just take care of myself, get off the screen, do something else so that like I can come back and re-engage in this. And I feel like COVID has really kind of like heightened that. But I also think my hope is beyond the time of COVID and the pandemic, we're still flexible, we're still innovative, we're still resilient, we're still paying attention to well-being. And as someone who like works with folks who are often in marginalized communities, I think about like who's got access to the resources, the technology, the bandwidth to be online. Sometimes people are in huge households where they don't have the bandwidth. And so, I mean, it's not, COVID has has magnified a lot of inequities, and we're thinking a lot about who really has the privilege of being online. So I think it's just something we're going to constantly be thinking about if this becomes to some degree the new normal, for the next few months or the next year, few years, who knows? So that's what we're thinking about.
I love that you brought that up. I actually want to build on that and then invite Utio and Eric to comment on this with this new build, this wellness piece, and also what is happening when we're all online, even more so than we were before as administrators. And then maybe some of us are struggling to get online in the ways that are expected in order to get the same kind of education that is being expected, right? Whether that's K through 12 or whether that's higher ed. A quick note that tomorrow we're having 2 sessions on a debate on virtual online programming, where we talk about this cognitive dissonance a lot of us are feeling around online learning and online programming, as well as how to host digital events, where we have a cyber psychologist coming in to talk about this well-being aspect as well of what it means to be online. So I love that. And you also pulled in that the pandemic, it's not just those who are already ahead of the game in innovation are just doing what they do. Everyone else is catching up, and that's going to stay with us for a long time. And so I'm going to expand the question to what else is going to stay here for a long time, and certainly continue to comment on the online learning piece as well.
Sure. I think, to resonate some of the stuff that we've been hearing and talking about, I think one way to think about it and look is that there is a difference between just education and learning. Learning is constant. It is happening, we like it or not, while education looks for the scaffold, the stable structure to support it. And that's where, the global learning framework comes in to, re-envision the work that we do and provide it a sense of conceptual clarity. But in this digital technology space, I completely resonate that we need to reimagine and nurture ourselves, in that well-being thing. So it is about a sensory perception. Education abroad is fulfilling that for us. So to use, say, a metaphor of food, and if you look at how the journey of food has morphed, right? There used to be a time when, we all love grandma's cooking and there used to be recipe books, right? Then we got YouTube videos and you started doing your own stuff and technology intervened. And now to the point where you have, a pre-cooked meal packaged and delivered to your door. So all segments have involved in that one process that used to be, a very, very different experience, and it has transformed. Can we take an example from that in how those senses are getting, structured and involved, and how we can take online environment, nurture ourselves to provide those things? So I'm making an analogy here, and I think this is for people to take away and see how they can relate to it. But I think there is something to learn here. You have the Alton Browns who talk about the science of food. You have the Guy Fieri's who are, taking you to the dives. Uh, and then you have the Anthony Bourdains who've brought in travel, the experience, and all of those kind of things. So I think there is something in international education that we can, look positively and go from there. But it needs to be fulfilling, and we should not diminish that.
Yeah, for me, I feel like the big unanswered question, that builds on a few points that the other panelists have made, is how do we effectively recreate an immersion experience in an international environment? And we can imagine how to recreate so many different elements of the kind of education we're talking about. Mentorship can go online. We can still convene people from different cultures and communities together online. We can create virtual experiences that are cross-cultural. And then we can, of course, put curriculum online. We can even build community online with student life events and things like that. But how do we create an immersion experience in a virtual setting? And that, for me, that's a big unanswered question, and I'm not the expert in this field, so would love the other panelists' thoughts on that, specifically, if there is, if you know, you do have some answers around that.
Does anyone want to take that up?
I was going to say something, but I see you're ready, so I'm like.
No, go ahead. I'll go after you.
I guess one of two things that I'm going to say. First, Eric, before I address your point, I just want to kind of piggyback to what Christine talked about, right? Because we mentioned the thing about access. And what I found was, due to going to this remote space as a result of a pandemic, there has been a intentionality placed now on education that I didn't experience before, where people tend to be more aware with basic human beings and their needs, right? So it's not this machinery that's been happening, like now we're online and go, 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 go. It has been more of deliberate questions of, like you said, how are you navigating an online space that you're not familiar with? How are you doing now that you may have different issues at home that are causing you to not be as attentive in your education process that you were before? And I think that humanity that's kind of being put at the forefront of how we're interacting with each other is a beautiful thing. And also looking at what Yutio said, when we look at the differences, I think a huge difference between education and learning is that we shouldn't skip the small stuff, right? Because in our cultures is going to be how we're going to integrate and use the technology. So that immersion process is happening every day with the interaction. It's happening as to when we're selecting the times for us to meet. It's happening as to the mode of technology that we prefer to use based on where we are, right? I spent a lot of my adult life living outside of the United States. Most recently, I was in Morocco, and I could tell you right now, watching news on TV is something that has been foreign to me for a long time. Facebook and WhatsApp has been my major mode of receiving information. And, you know, when I say to people, oh my God, I just saw this on WhatsApp, and they're saying to me, what? What is WhatsApp? And so I'm like telling my friends here in New York, like, you got to get it. This is what it is. This is the, you know, this is how you join, or even using a group me are things that you might find in different cultures, but are not necessarily, you know, the basis for where you are right now. And I think all of those speak to this remote or online environment. It's not only about creating, you know, spaces, but it's about how the different people or different cultures are using the spaces that are already created, and paying attention also to that process and how we're integrating it. Martha?
Wow, tough act to follow. No, and I'm building on that, I suppose, in a way, because I think the short answer to your question is immersion is not possible, which means we need a different goal. I think that one of the problems, perhaps, of the tradition and mythology in education abroad is that it's had a very narrow idea of what is good and bad study abroad. And it makes me a little bit frustrated and sometimes insane, because it's sort of this, I teach short-term programs. I take students who've never been on an airplane to Ireland for 3 weeks. And are they immersed? No. Is that my goal? No. Do they learn a ton? Do they experience difference? Do we talk about who's marginalized in that society? Do they look at the role of film and literature, which is what I'm teaching, in creating cultural identities? Do they interrogate their own cultural identities? Yes, 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 yes. So I think that instead of the focus being on an idea of what it should be, you know, the question is, if we are choosing a virtual internship, then what is the best possible program design, and what are the learning goals and outcomes for a virtual internship, because it is not an internship abroad. And so to kind of try to put that square peg in that round hole means we'll fail. So I think the opportunity is for all of us to take a step back and sort of say, wow, this is a completely new medium. And to, again, support the points others have made. I think from an access standpoint, we, this summer, when we rolled these out and did the recruitment, we had 3 students from our College of Continuing Education sign up. I'm quite sure we haven't sent a student from that college abroad on a program for probably a couple of years, and certainly never to do an internship abroad. So that was a bit of an aha moment for me, because these students are doing a placement with an organization in Rome or Taipei, and they are connecting with people in those locations and doing work for those organizations. So back to Fabiola's point, they're using social media and technology to do something that they can't maybe do in person.
I'll quickly just add to this that, what I have always loved about international education, and, I think I've only had international education ever in my life, whether kindergarten or elsewhere, just traveling around, um, is that the discovery of place really has led to the discovery of self. And that journey is modality independent, and it should not be tied to whether you're getting on a plane or you're interfacing on a YouTube video or on a Zoom meeting or howsoever.
Does anyone else have anything they'd like to add on the question of immersion, well-being, online learning before we move on?
I had a quick follow-up, Martha, actually, because I really liked this example of like students, who hadn't typically been able to access our program now are doing that. I'm curious, like how that goes from, I'm putting words in your mouth, like more from like it kind of just happened to like the intention, like, does it make you think about like, what's the intentionality of like creating more access, or like, how does that come into play when those moments happen? Because I'm curious how you're thinking about it. And I'm sorry for putting you on the spot, but like that moment or that thing is really interesting to say, is that a gateway for even more students to get access to, opportunities that maybe weren't accessible to them before?
Absolutely. No, thank you for saying that. I mean, I think, again, my whole career has been kind of searching for those aha moments of who's not participating and what are we doing wrong? And where, if you're actually paying attention, do you suddenly see, if we were struggling to get Asian American students abroad, and we ran a short-term program to Thailand that filled with Asian American students, it's sort of, I call it the field of dreams. If you build it, they will come. If a group isn't going, what are you doing wrong? And I think, so whenever we try, but then suddenly see some movement, you have to be paying enough attention, even at all levels of an organization, to say, that's really interesting. What did we do right in that case? And how do we expand on it?
I'd like to just continue that question, actually. Social, political, and economic change has been top of mind in the US and the world, particularly as it relates to systemic racism and the impact that has on Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So continuing the question of how are in each of your contexts, how are your organizations, how are your people, how are your communities creating more access to educational opportunities? And how do you see that playing out in the next decade?
Sharing my
institution.
Fabiola, go ahead.
Fabiola, go ahead.
I feel like my timing, right? I was going to say, I'm at a community college within a large state system, right? And we're also a minority serving institution, HSI, Hispanic serving institution. And one of the things that online has done for us, we know the benefits, for example, of study abroad, right? We are the champions, we're the advocates, we drink that Kool-Aid. And so what it allowed for us is to look internally within our structures and to have more internal partnerships. Whereas before, global education was something that was deemed external, an external process and an external service provider and whatnot. Now we're looking at what are those internal programs that can also enhance and work well and complement what we say the goals and missions of global education are. And we're looking at the students who traditionally perhaps would not have had a chance to take a short-term trip because of finances or because of other obligations or because of just general interest, right? I know for myself, when I'm going my first study abroad trip, I went and I was the only girl on the trip. I was not excited to go. My parents made the decision and I had to go because I wanted to be on a trip with other people who look like me, who had the same interest as me. And we know in general, the numbers and statistics of study abroad, it's a very specific type of student that takes advantage of these trips. So what we've done is we've kind of integrated a lot of new virtual exchange opportunities in courses and in programs that traditionally didn't have them, or the types of programs that students traditionally did not go on physical mobile trips. So that has allowed us to build upon on that narrative for more inclusion in our programmings and offering, and having more of a equitable opportunity for our students. And it's a positive shift, a lot of buy-in around for faculty. But what I'm learning is the fact that people want to be asked to do stuff because it allows them to feel special. So when you kind of ask someone, hey, I thought about you, you would be the perfect person, you kind of get that hair flick of, who, me? Oh, and so it has been a great experience, on that end for us. And it's allowed us to offer to our students who traditionally wouldn't have had the opportunity to now take advantage of all the great things that we're saying all students should have the opportunity to have.
So I'm at the University of Denver as the vice provost, and I've been here only, 6, 7 months, of which, most of it has been in this pandemic mode, um, moving here from Cornell. But as we have been, thinking through as a team, I'm really proud to say that as we talk of diversity, inclusion, equity, these kind of things, they have all been wanting to think through it, and we've been going through a intense design thinking process internally on reimagining who we want to be, and it resonates with some of my own value system, and we talk about it often within our team, and that the root cause of this inequity is our failure to recognize each other as a fellow human being. um, Prejudice is omnipresent, but humans have the incredible capacity to bridge that gap. Compassion, understanding, empathy, they can do wonders, and it never stops giving. Um, but we have to take the time to hear the stories of our students who are taking the opportunity to go abroad, our international students who have come here, and in the communities we go, um, where we find these stories and learn to um, build upon each other and understand, find the frameworks, the context, and have the mindset to understand them, and then have the time to internalize it. um, we truly need the capacity to celebrate each other. The world is diverse, and it has always been that way. We have to take away our rose colored glasses, face the reality, but now more so than ever, we have to do something about it. Um, a lot of my work has been in the area of sustainability. The world is covered by 70% water, and yet we have only like clean drinking water, which is accessible to barely 1% of the population. You know, these are the inequities uh, that keep me up at night. This is what we want our students in these journeys around the world to understand, to take away. I worry about the world we will leave our children. Okay, my children, will they speak other languages? Will they find love across borders? Will they treat each other with respect or others with respect? um, so access really, it is much more than a resource problem. It really definitely is an intentionality gap that we need to fix.
Christine and Eric, I'm wondering from your contexts, which are very different than the study abroad context, how you would answer this question.
Christine, go for it. Unless you want me
I
to
was
start.
He's off mute, so he's going. I'm happy to. So, geez, I'm thinking about a lot of things. I mean, the work around diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'd even go more specific to say kind of social justice, racial justice is so core to what we do. And I think just a little by way of background, like Moonshot is about support, again, as Samantha mentioned, supporting underrepresented leaders to design and launch new schools and programs. And some of that belief system for me comes from the fact that at least in K-12, right, the gap between our white students and students of color continues to grow. And when I looked at who was leading our students, that it wasn't a demographic that matched the communities they were trying to serve. And so to me, I kind of like rest on the hypothesis that we have to empower communities to be in charge of their own change, and therefore need to recruit and support leaders, give them tools, resources, access to build solutions within their community. And what I'm thinking about is Fabiola's comment around, like, people want to be asked. And what's so interesting is when we bring people into our fellowship, 81% of them identify as people of color. Most of them are like, I never even thought I could start something. I never saw myself as an entrepreneur. I didn't know this was for me. And because half the time they can't be what they can't see, right? So when I think about, like, when we're looking to diversify the pool, the pipeline of anything, right? The question is, like, who's inviting you in? Who's telling you you have a seat at the table? And who's that leader that's telling you that? Because do you inherently trust them? Do they understand you? And so I think both, like, who's in the seat of making those decisions? Who's in the seat of building that pipeline? And, like, what is the messaging that's given to people? And are you saying it to, like, be like, oh, I want to save you? Or it's like, I'm here to empower you and to support you on a journey that you have so much potential to, like, go down that path. And I just think so much, Fabiola, of the people we are supporting who are just like, nobody even ever asked me what my ideas were or if I could do this. And I think about the same for study abroad or international ed. Like, do people see them, you know, as like, is this for me? And who sends them that message? So, you know, I think about that, and I think about Utia's comment, like, in this beauty of, like, what the world can be, it also requires, like, a heavy level of discomfort of a lot of people kind of plodding clumsily through a whole bunch of different things, from, like, how are we as an organization, what systems are we upholding that prevent certain people from accessing what we have, to who are we as people and the biases that we hold. I mean, that is just, it's like constant examination. It's uncomfortable and it's necessary if we are saying, like, the things that we are providing are for everyone. And in some cases, like, we're directly going to support folks who have just historically not been supported on this, you know, specific pathway.
Christine, in your intro, you said, I feel like the odd person out on this panel, but if it's not clear to everyone in the room why you're on this panel, then they should just leave. So thank you for sharing that, those words. I felt inspired when you were speaking. When all of you were speaking, Eric, you know, where does Watson, where do you and the educational programming that you've been running, where do you stand on this issue?
Yeah, it resonated a lot with what Christine said. I mean, Watson, for context, selects a small group of young entrepreneurs and leaders. We provide the training, the mentorship, the networks for them to accelerate their careers, accelerating their impactful, successful careers and ventures. And we're very fortunate to work with an incredibly diverse group of students. So we select about 25 to 30 students at each cohort in Boulder. And I mean, you walk into this room and it's not long before you realize this is probably the most diverse group of 25 to 30 students you could imagine, from you know, from a socioeconomic standpoint, racial standpoint, religious standpoint, gender standpoint. It's just kind of got everything in that small mix. And the beautiful part of it is that we're bringing these students in, convening them together, and they're under one roof, living together, learning from each other in Chautauqua Park in Boulder. So a beautiful place right next to the Rocky Mountains, where they're able to go on walks together and stay up until 2 a.m. working on projects together. We have something called the Innovation Porch, which is notorious for students going out there late into the evening and building and creating things together. So you quickly end up having someone who is from inner city Denver, inner city Miami, working alongside an entrepreneur from Africa, an entrepreneur from China, and an entrepreneur from the wealthiest county in Connecticut. And just all of a sudden those lines get crossed, and you have this cross-pollination that's amazing. And I think, you know, Christine, to your point, it's inspiring for us to see this pipeline, because yes, we're very intentional about selecting diversity, but also when you just look at the applications we receive and the diversity of the applications, like, there's incredible talent, entrepreneurial talent, leadership talent from every walk of life, from every corner of this planet and our country too. And so we're lucky to get to see a cross slice of that, and then support them in accessing the opportunities that will help accelerate their work. And then the last thing I'd say quickly is I do think there is a resource issue as well. So it's, it's answering that resource question when the price tag of education is so high is critical. And especially when student debt is one of the main ways that people end up affording that high price tag, graduating with an average of $28,000-$30,000 of student debt and an education that didn't necessarily lead to a job. That's a challenge. And it's especially a challenge if you're coming from an underprivileged background. So at Watson, we don't do any debt. If students can't pay tuition up front, we do income sharing. So folks on this call might be familiar with income sharing as a concept, but basically it means that students don't pay for their education until they get a job, are earning salary above a minimum threshold, and then they only share a percentage for a set number of years. So it means two things. One, we take on the risk instead of students taking on the risk. With student debt, all the risk ends up on the student's shoulders, which is much easier to take if you come from a privileged background. That risk is more feasible. If you come from an underprivileged background, to take on all that risk is extra hard. With income sharing, we take on that risk because if our education doesn't pay off, then our financial model also doesn't work. So the risk is where it should be. The incentives are aligned in the income sharing model. And that also enables students from diverse backgrounds to be able to come to Watson and access these opportunities, knowing that that's the financial mechanism in which they can make it work.
Thanks for that, Eric. I'll share that I had the privilege of being a mentor for one of the Watson Scholars this past semester. And I was blown away by this student cohort from literally all over the world. And I agree with that statement. It was that room of young entrepreneurs was ready to shake some things up from their context. And it was really great to see. Also a note to folks who are in the audience, earlier today, we had a panel on funding the next decade in international education, where we did actually have a discussion on income sharing agreements. So if you missed that, there'll be a recording later on, and welcome anyone else's thoughts on that. Yeah, Martha, go ahead.
I just wanted to make one additional comment before we move on from this topic, because it is so important, and it's so great hearing everyone's ideas, because of course you're like, yes, yes, yes. But to Christina and Fabiola's points, I mean, I think, if people are at institutions and sort of saying, how do I diversify things? The point of representation is huge. And I had to get over myself, and starting about 10 years ago when we piloted the AID roadmap with Diversity Abroad, I started writing to faculty of color who I'd never met, but who I'd heard were good instructors, or I asked around. And I would just say, can I take you for a coffee and talk to you about the possibility of you developing a study abroad program? And then if they had not been abroad or didn't know what that process was, I helped fund it. And it was sometimes really uncomfortable because I'm an introvert. And so you're like, hi, you don't know me, you have no reason to trust me, but this is really important to me. And so, to really strategically figure out, again, who was not participating from the faculty level, from the people in the OED office, from the people who, were just outside of the conversation, or we kept doing calls for it, but we weren't asking it the right way. So I really found that by personally going out and really making myself available to the conversation, that made a big difference. And then the last point, I'm from Minneapolis, and so I would be remiss in not bringing up what a extraordinary summer it has been for us in terms of having to deal with histories of brutality that are not part of the Minnesota nice story that a lot of people like to tell, but that those of us who are from here are certainly aware of and have been on our social justice agenda. And so I think one of the things we started doing that we're particularly proud of is when we started succeeding in attracting and getting more students abroad from various identities, we also found that our on-site structures were not really ready for that. And that, as Fabiola, I'm sure could tell you, constructions of race are completely different in Morocco than they are in the US. And so I'm a little worried that the field is rushing to diversity before we've tackled inclusion. And so we've now done 24 on-site workshops and trainings. My academic area is constructions of American identity in drama and performance. So we go deep on American identity as a flawed constructed project. And we really try to help our on-site structures understand the complexities of systemic racism and oppression, so that they understand why hyphenated identities are so darn important to our students. You know, we've really had to, and to say that that must have been tough and not try to fix it is really sometimes all you need to do, but to never say it's cultural. You know, some of the things that historically people have said, and then that ends the conversation. So I think as we do better on the recruitment front, we really have to be mindful of the experience and the preparedness of our instructors and on-site partners to facilitate some of those conversations, given the context our students are coming from.
Martha, I really love how you're bringing in both a faculty academic perspective as well as the administrative perspective on how we start and continue to think about these issues and then act on them and lean into the discomfort that you talked about, which I think is an extraordinarily important message for our audience to hear. I feel like we could talk for 5 hours. We're actually coming up on our last
one more thing before
11
we
minutes.
move on.
So I'd like to
I
ask.
say one more thing before we move on.
Yeah, you sure can. Go for it.
And Martha, if you couldn't tell, I'm so excited about what you brought up, because oftentimes there is a huge focus on diversity, right? And we say inclusion, right? It's like diversity and inclusion. And I think now the intent for inclusion has to be really profound and pronounced. Yutio talked about sharing stories and hearing stories, and it could be as simple as that, as having the conversations and as inviting people to share their authentic selves to their experience, so that we can make sure everyone has a seat at the table, but also that their voice is also heard throughout the conversations that we are having at the table. So thank you for sharing that, because I think it is important that diversity and inclusion are as much pronounced as they should be.
Thank you for that. And I'll uplift that our closing keynote panel tomorrow night is with a crew called New Directions. And they will be giving some TED style talks on diversity, equity, and inclusion, as well as Gen Z and the impacts of COVID and a whole bunch of other things. So I hope everyone joins us for that. I have 2 more questions, and then I'm, optional for folks to stick around to take some questions from the audience. This next question is actually directed at the folks that have been in traditionally mobility programs. So Fabiola, Tio, and Martha, the mobility side of international education was really founded post-World War II, when the leaders of governments had effectively said formal diplomacy has failed, and we now need to do something about that and formalize institutions that create people-to-people diplomacy and cross-border engagement, right? And so that's really, Martha, to your point, how the field has been evolving. That's really how the field has been evolving in the last however many years. And my question to you is, do you think international education should continue to be focused on mobility programs as the primary way to fulfill that mission in the next decade? Or do you think we need to expand our idea of what international education is and does? And maybe, Utia, you clued us in earlier when you talked about modality. So I'm wondering if you can each briefly comment on that, and then I'd like to follow up with a question for Christine and Eric.
So one of the things I want to talk about that, spoke about modality. When we're not stuck at a border crossing or, excluded because of a travel ban. The idea is education is inherently global today. It is being consumed globally, and it is being created globally. Um, what we need to really envision is the associated learning, the learning outcomes, and how are we in this process advancing skill sets and human values? Where are we leaving our students? How are we preparing them better for their future and the future of this world? And to that end, there's so much talk about, advancement and, elitism and all of those things. So along with IQs, there's a lot of talk about EQ and emotional quotient, but there's also a social quotient. And more importantly today, there is the other aspect of adversity quotient, especially in a sense like COVID. It's never a better time to think that, we need to train our students to develop all of these, tell them how important the EQs and the SQs are, not only the IQs. So the you have to wrap it up in that, but also we need to train them on the AQ. And education abroad, by taking people in journeys that they have not been before, uncomfortable situations build resiliency. So all of those things are eventual part of the overall character growth and human development. So we need to nurture all of these.
I can go and then Fabiola can bring it home. Um, I think this is a great question because I think, again, in the 30 years I've been in the field, whenever a new model emerges, people talk about it as if it's a zero-sum game, that short-term programs will be the death of semesters and that online learning will be the death of short-term programs, and everyone has this ability to retrench or a tendency to do that. In my experience, all boats rise, and so I actually think that more exposure and interaction and interest from students in the rest of the world tends to feed into all these things. I do think at the end of the day, education abroad will be finite. And I'd love to ever get to that point because we're nowhere near it. But I do think that there is at many institutions, some not too similar to perhaps a DU, 70% of the students are going abroad. The numbers are probably pretty healthy, and probably lots of students know that they have access to that. But I think this question of international education is infinite. International education can never be done because it will always change and evolve and find a new manifestation and a new direction to go. And so I think, to one, maybe, but not there yet. And the idea that one will present the death of the other is just short-sighted thinking that I don't buy into.
Great, thank you so much. And I completely agree with both UTO's and Mather's perspective on it. And I'd also like to kind of just add a different lens to how we think about education abroad. As you mentioned in your opening, right, Sam, you talked about education abroad. The foundation of it was diplomatic, right? It was diplomacy, because at the root of diplomacy is survival. It's the recognition that alone you cannot accomplish much, and together you can accomplish more. And so when I think about education abroad, I always bring it back to the economics of it, right? Because it is about survival and it is about communal survival. It's recognizing that one institution, one culture, one country, one people alone will not be able to sustain whatever mode of life we are in right now. And so when we're looking at these opportunities, whether it's virtual, whether it's, actually moving, I really focus on the why is it that we're doing this? Why is it important for us to understand and know and be aware of different perspectives, but also to know what's happening in the environment and the world around us? Because we've seen it better exemplified in front of us right now with COVID-19, that there is no isolation of anything. Sooner or later, it's gonna knock at your front door and it's gonna bang hard. So you have to be able to be prepared. You got to know what's going on. And most importantly, you got to recognize what your role and your contribution will be in that space. So when we're looking at education abroad, it is not, again, it's not a luxury, right? Like you said, it's not a zero-sum game of one or the other. It is about survival. And in order for all of us to survive, right, all of us need to, number one, respect and celebrate each other, have the opportunity to share with ourselves and one another who we are, and also value what it is that we're doing in our different spaces. And so I always use that, we have the Open Doors report that shows us, we have the, $452 billion in the US economy that international students bring in, right? We have the 1 out of 6 employers who are saying global competency is the number one skill set they're looking for in order for their employees to get a job. So at the end of the day, what are we doing to ensure that we maintain our survival as a world, as humans, right? Not as Americans or Chinese or what, as humans, because that's one variable that regardless of where you live, we all have in common. And it's all of our responsibilities to ensure that we have a better place that we could leave for all of our kids. And so I just like people to think about it, that diplomacy is about survival and education abroad is about diplomacy, which in the end is about survival as one race, one community, which is under the umbrella of humanity.
I love that. Fabiola, I have a master's degree in peace and conflict studies, but no one has said to me in those clear terms, diplomacy is about survival. And that really hit home. Appreciate you sharing that perspective. In our last few minutes that we have, Eric and Christine, you both founded organizations where innovation is baked into the DNA of your organizations themselves, and then the kind of educational programming that you are supporting within your organizations. Can you talk to us about, can you tell us why innovation is so core to that work that you do and why you think it matters for the decade ahead?
Eric, I'm going to make you go first.
Oh, man. Gosh. Yeah, I mean, I think innovation is exactly what we need in education right now. I don't think there's any denying that. I think a lot of what inspires me is Muhammad Yunus said recently that this could be the generation, the first generation in human history that lives in a world whereby there is no such thing as poverty. We have 100%, our energy comes 100% from renewable sources, and every child has access to a quality education. This could be the generation that sees that world. And as the father of a 7-month-old son, I very much hope that my son will grow up to see that world and live in that world. And the key to getting there, we believe, is innovating in education. And the reason for that is because we think that education is the root cause to a lot of these problems, and developing a generation of leaders versus waiting for big leaders to solve big problems, which has kind of been the mantra of the previous century. What does it look like for everyone to be a leader? And how do we design our education systems to produce that kind of world, which requires a lot of innovation, so that we can accelerate this pace of change and get to that world that I think we're all driving for. And that requires fundamentally changing the way we think about education, both the curriculum in the classroom, but also the role of the teacher, the professor, the role of mentors, and the role of the community itself. So very much core to why we are innovating, what our mission is in education is to drive towards that world by developing a generation of young leaders.
Samantha, I know we're so close to 10, so I'll be really brief. Thanks, Eric, for letting me you to go.
I imagine folks are just like ready to hear and are likely going to stick around for what it is you have to say. So I appreciate you closing us out.
Thanks. I think to what Martha mentioned, I think the last couple of weeks we have all been heightened awareness around systemic racism, how we support undocumented immigrants in our country, how we treat LGBTQ populations. I would say, a lot of people say our system is broken, but I think the reality is our system is designed to do exactly what it's done, which is marginalize certain people and allow other people to thrive. And I think, to me, if we are going to design differently, we need to open ourselves up to innovation in a very different way. And I love Eric's point that it's in some ways, it's the young folks or it's the folks who have not been given the opportunity to make a decision about what the future should look like that have the best ideas, because they're not jaded by having tried something too many times over and say, well, that can't work, this doesn't work. And they dream bigger oftentimes than I don't know all of us on the panel very well, bigger than we can. And so when I think about we've designed a system that doesn't actually work, and we need to design something fundamentally different to reach, I think, the potential Eric is talking about, who is leading that change and what spaces are we giving them to design and build something different? I mean, I think if we don't, we will end up with more of the same. And I think all of us, and many people, I think at this point, and even on this panel, we have to do things fundamentally differently, whether it's for surviving or it's thriving. I think we all want to live in a different reality. And if we don't give ourselves the space and the courage to innovate, I worry about what can come next. But I'm inspired by the folks who take the next leap, right? And inspired by the spaces we all create for those folks to like live into their potential.
I love that. Thanks so much, Christine. Your organization has a tagline about dreaming big. Would you be willing to share that with everyone?
Oh, we have too many taglines. I feel like we have everything from like thinking the impossible is possible to, I mean, there's just so many. I mean, we're called Moonshot for a reason. Like there's this video on YouTube that's it is called Moonshot Thinking. It's not our video. And someone says, you know, if you like ask someone to make a car go to like get 50 miles a gallon, they're going to tinker with it. But if you ask them to have a car that's at 500 miles per gallon, you fundamentally take things apart and build it back together. And I just think like if we are fundamentally looking for something different, we can't go for the like incremental change. We got to go for like what's big. And I think that kind of mindset drives us. But you kind of have to be a little bit of, it's like unafraid to think of the impossible and believing that is actually possible to do.
Unafraid to think of the impossible. Thank you so much. I want to thank our panelists so much for bringing your stories, for bringing your experience, your expertise, your ideas, your opinions to this panel and spending time with all of us today. I am going to certainly stick around. And for those folks that maybe put questions out, we will make sure to circle back and give the panel an opportunity to answer those, and we will send that out. I'll also invite you all. You're not obligated to stay, but certainly if you want to take a question or two, we welcome that. Otherwise, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. So adios for those who need to take off. For those who are going to stick around for another minute, I'm going to poke in and see if there are any questions or if anybody wants to network. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Okay, via team, I'm gonna check our Slack channels here to see if anyone has a big question. This is a live stream, so chat questions are coming through on YouTube actually, which is fun. Everyone's like, okay, got it. They're telling me that good news on that side, but everyone is, I think, enraptured. We don't actually have questions at the moment, no major questions. So I'll thank you all again. We'll formally close the event and close down the live stream. And thank you, audience, for joining us today. We hope to see you tomorrow. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Samantha.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.